Welcome to our first Visual Studies podcast. Today we're going to have a look at the link between photography, science, and human measurement, and specifically as it relates to our very own South African context and our very own Stellenbosch University. So to help me discuss this today, I have Dr. Hanri Wolters here, and she's going to speak to us a little bit about the work, or rather the history of physical anthropology as it was practiced here at Stellenbosch University. So, Hanri, you've got a photo with you today that our listeners can see. Won't you just give us a little bit of context as to where it came from, what it was used for, and how this relates to our topic today?
Yes, Michaela, thank you for having me. The photograph you're seeing on screen is a photograph taken by Dr. Kurt Grobelaar. This was taken in 1961, and it was eventually published in 1964 as part of the publication Suggested Norms of Physical Status for White South African Males aged 10 to 26. Now, Grobelaar was Stellenbosch University's physical anthropologist, and he operated from the zoology department. He had a keen interest in human measurement, and the study of white males and white Afrikaans-speaking males, students of Stellenbosch, goes back to way back to the 20s. It was actually their first endeavor as physical anthropologists was to measure white Afrikaans-speaking male students in 1925. Now, this study in 1961 was a scientific study that related nutrition and growth to the physical status of white South African males, and they employed measurement and photography to conduct this study.
You know, it's interesting to see how in the 60s that photography was still such an important part of physical anthropology and this idea of human measurement, because actually there's a long history of linking physical anthropology with photography. I mean, in the second half of the 19th century, we have both the development and the establishment of photography as a technique, as a representational technique, as a kind of medium. And at the same time, we have the establishment of various kinds of what is called human sciences, so psychiatry, anthropology, criminology, a variety of kind of sciences are being developed and being kind of institutionalized at the same time that photography is coming into its own. And I mean, it's fascinating to see this kind of imagery, because we have individuals like Francis Galton, who was working in Britain in the late 19th century. He's kind of known as the father of eugenics, and he used photography quite a lot. Specifically, what he was trying to do is he would layer photographs in order to try and find the kind of common characteristics. He was looking particularly at what he called the criminal type, which was trying to layer various images of people who'd been arrested or charged as criminals and layered these images in order to see where their features would overlap. So where, like, what eye shape or what ear shape or what nose shape or what expression was supposedly common or essential to this concept.
So, you know, when you mentioned Galton and his use of photography to illustrate in essence, it's interesting because Galton's theories emerged at a particular time with the development of physical anthropology as well. So the photographic technique, the portrait photograph and the profile photograph, contributed a lot to the science of physical anthropology, to illustrate an essence and often a racial essence. So a lot of the publications in the early 1900s, I'm thinking about The Races of Man just around the turn of the century, would illustrate racial difference through portrait photography and profile photography. Now, this photograph taken by Grobelaar was in 1961, and physical anthropology had moved on by this time. They were focusing on growth and nutrition studies. But in the early 20th century, they were really focused on racial difference to a large extent by using photography. Grobelaar conducted a study on the South African Qurana between 1947 and 1952. Now, this is post-World War II. It is technically at a time when physical anthropology had already moved on as a discipline, and yet Grobelaar conducted this study, and he again employed measurement and photography to illustrate difference and to illustrate possibly a racial essence. What you find with his study with the Qurana is that the photography is not like you see here of a collective, but rather of individuals. So very much more reminiscent of Galton's photography and Bourtillon's photography. The other thing that he used, he also employed an eye color scale, a hair color scale, and a skin color scale. And it also spoke to the visual elements of his research subjects, and thereby contributing to this notion of an essence that can be observed.
You know, it's interesting you speak about this idea of measuring according to these various scales, and this kind of individualizing according to portrait and profile photographs. And you even mentioned Bourtillon, who was, he was a French, I think he was a criminologist or a criminal anthropologist, also 19th century, who was, in my opinion, obsessed with this idea of measurement and its kind of uses, or its co-use with photography. So he quite literally developed a method of photography called batillontage, which was this idea that if you kind of put a subject on a chair at a exact distance from the camera, that you can somehow capture the very specific characteristics of that individual in a way that meant that these images were or could be considered evidence, to the point where these records, and they were really considered evidentiary records, were used against what he called criminal recidivism. So this idea of repeat offenders, that they could be identified by police, that these kind of documents, that these images could be basically used against the people that they depicted. So the police could go out and say, oh, we know you've offended before, and as a result we can give you a harsher sentence. So there's this interesting kind of push and pull between this idea of depicting an essence, and that Galton does, that it appears Grobelaar was trying to achieve by finding these by studying the so-called Qurana, and yet at the same time this kind of obsession with individualized details, as basically, John Tark calls photography a technology of the state, in that it is a tool to regulate citizens and regulate individuals, because it is so close to, or because photographs can count as evidence. So does this idea of the technology of the state, or this idea of being able to kind of use photography against the people who are photographed, does that resonate with your own research in terms of physical anthropology and the South African context at all?
Well, if you look at the moment in which Grobelaar studies the Qurana, it's quite interesting, because as I mentioned, it was between 1948 and 1952 that he studied the Qurana. And, this is a South African moment when the apartheid state is implemented. 1948, the National Party comes to power. And by 1950, we have the Population Registration Act, dividing our country's citizens into 4 racial categories. If we talk about a technology of the state, and as regulated by racial categories, we can also think about what it meant for the state to implement apartheid, and to implement specifically the Population Registration Act, which required the state to categorize each individual. And they did so. There are many theories out there as to what apartheid really rested on, but a large part of it was through visual markers. if you read textbooks at the time, and many of them used at Stellenbosch, it would tell you that a race can be identified by things like the color of their eyes, the color of their hair and skin, by the breadth of their nose. So these racial essences of the late 19th century and early 20th century is all of a sudden making a subtle comeback as a technology of the state.
No, that's. I mean, I can't help but think about the very fact that our own ID documents, right, that they carry so much weight, that they are such vital elements to our kind of day-to-day lives as South African citizens, and how they kind of bear an image of ourselves that somehow is, this mode of identification. And even in more subtle ways, the fact that our ID number used to have a place where our race, our racial category would be indicated. Obviously,
Exactly.
in 1994, this kind of was done away with, and now I think all we have is little a. But along with our birth date, along with whether we are on South African citizens, along with our gender, whether we're male or female, race played a significant part. And, it's interesting what you say about this idea of how reliant the state was on these ideas of racial markers to decide what race group we belong to, and how this kind of interpretation would be implemented as state policy, as a kind of marker on who we are, not according to ourselves, but rather according to our appearance and according to these kind of rules and notions of an essence that was dictated by others.
Exactly.
Great. Adri, this was a really interesting walk through and step back in time and look at the kind of ties between the kind of past and the present, and the way in which not only photography but this idea of the visual markers of race and the idea of human beings as measurable entities comes together. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.